They had a couple of ships blown out of the sea in front of them, and that usually results in some kind of violent response.
This video is sponsored by Patreon Mensch1066, who chose this topic as part of his reward perk. Thanks very much for the support. For more information on Patreon rewards, check out the link in the description.
Hello everybody and welcome back to Military Aviation History. I'm your host Bismarck, and today we're going back to 1942. It is early March of that year and the Japanese have just successfully landed in New Guinea in the South Pacific next to the towns of Lae and Salamaua. The landings proceed without a hitch, but soon the Japanese will experience firsthand what it means to be caught flat-footed by an enemy carrier fleet. Yes indeed, it's only 4 months after Pearl Harbor, but America is back with a vengeance, securing their first major victory in the theater in an attack that most people haven't even heard about. While the Japanese were conducting their landings, there was in fact a US carrier fleet in the area. This was under the command of Admiral Wilson Brown and included the carrier Lexington and Yorktown. They were proceeding in radio silence towards Harbour, however this had to be broken twice. Once in order to avoid collision between the ships during a storm, and once in a doomed attempt to guide back a recon aircraft. So the game was up essentially, and the element of surprise was lost. Admiral Brown and Captain Sherman of the Lexington conferred and realized that once they got reports from an Australian recon aircraft showing the location of the Japanese landing, that they might have a shot here, and a sneaky little plan developed between their ears. So instead of continuing north towards Harbour, the task force turned northwest towards the Gulf of Papua, passing Port Moresby in the process. This put the ships out of harm's way, since the Japanese were really only conducting recon missions on the other side of the island. But while the sailors were happy, the pilots really weren't. The problem for them was that between the carriers and the landing sites, there was the treacherous Stanley Range. This was a ragged and undulating mountain pass going all the way up to 10,000, 13,000 feet. That's roughly 3,000, 4,000 meters. And to make matters worse, this area was also known for sudden and unforgiving changes in weather conditions, and you really didn't want to get lost in that mountain pass with your aircraft. So in the attempt to find a suitable route, 2 recon missions was flown out, and they did find a suitable approach. However, there were still some risks involved. In order to beat, for example, the unfavorable weather conditions, the launch was set for the early morning hours of the 10th of March. But instead of having me explain the process, let's turn to aviator Jimmy Thatch.
Well now, an awful lot of work has to be done before an attack. Information has to be obtained and checked. Geographical facts, weather forecasts, what enemy forces are where. Now, all this information went to Captain Sherman, and he had to okay the final plan. But before he published the operational order, he would consult with all squadron commanders. Now, if we didn't like a tentative plan, we said so. He would consider everything and always came out with the best possible answer.
Somewhat reminiscent of the attack that America experienced at Pearl Harbor only a couple of months before, this attack was staggered into 2 waves. First up was Lexington, followed by Yorktown. Now on Lexington, Fighting 3 was commanded by Thatch, flying 8 F4F Wildcats. They were followed by Dixon's 18 SPD Dauntlesses from Scouting 2. Additional Dauntlesses were flying Inhabitants Bombing 2, 12 of them, and the strike force was completed with Brett's Torpedo 2 flying 13 TBD Devastators. There was also 1 additional SPD Dauntless flown by Commander Ault. He will become important later on. Now these elements were supposed to take off in 10-minute intervals, and 20 minutes later Yorktown was supposed to follow with a very similar strike force. However, as sound as this plan looked on paper, there were quite a lot of problems. Let's talk about the Wildcats first. Now these were supposed to escort the strike and make sure that if the Japanese got any planes up, they wouldn't bother the strike aircraft of SPD Dauntlesses and Devastators. However, for this attack, they were pretty much operating at the maximum limit of their range. The carriers were only parked roughly 45 miles offshore, but considering the distance to and fro, that was enough. To make matters worse for the pilot on Lexington, for the Wildcat pilots on Lexington, they also had to weigh down their aircraft with 2 additional bombs, 1 on each wing. Now these were only 30-pound bombs, pretty much nothing more than a glorified hand grenade, but with the pylons and the bombs that would add weight and drag, and this does negatively affect the aircraft's range, which means that Fatch essentially only had roughly 10 minutes of staying time over the target. And considering that his strike aircraft would come out in for a duration of 30 minutes, this wasn't exactly ideal. Now, luckily for the Americans, the cowboys over on Yorktown had actually removed the pylons a couple of weeks prior, so they didn't have to weigh down the aircraft with, well, little dingy bombs. Another issue involved Lexington, the carrier herself. Now, because of her internal arrangement and the amount of planes that were on this mission and the fact that it only had one elevator, there was somewhat of an issue. You see, if you do the calculation and take into account the different cruising speeds of the Dauntlesses, the Devastators and the Wildcats, you would realize that the Wildcats have to be the last one to take off, because then they were just on the way to the target, bypass the Devastators, the Dauntlesses, still be there in time to be essentially the first element to arrive, clear the sky of any Japanese opposition, and make sure that the strike aircraft go in safely. There is just one issue. Because of Lexington's design, the Wildcats had to take off first to clear the deck space. There was simply no way of rearranging everything in time. So what did Lexington and Fighting Free do? Well, they did take off first, but if they now would go towards the target zone, they would arrive way too early and would really not be help to anybody. And if they lingered around Lexington and then went towards Lae-Salamaua, they would probably not have the fuel to take back. So instead of doing either, well, they just circled around the carrier and kept on circling while the Dauntlesses took off, while the Devastators took off. And then when the deck space was clear, they landed, topped up their aircraft, took off again, and raced after the Devastators and the Dauntlesses. And yes, they did arrive in time and everything worked out fine. There was one more significant issue with this plan. And this actually endangered the life of some of the pilots involved in the strike, and it had to do with the TBD Devastator. I actually have the pilot's flight operation instructions right here, the manual as it is. You'll remember that in order to get to the Japanese, the Americans would have to cross the Owen Stanley Range. And even though the path they chose to get there was not as high as some of the other places in this mountain pass, they would have to essentially get up to roughly 7,500 feet, that's 2,500 meters, give or take. There was serious doubt whether the Devastators, loaded with a torpedo, would be able to make that altitude in time. However, there was an alternative loadout, and actually it's also included in the manual, and that is, instead of taking a torpedo, you take bombs. And the loadout chosen was two 500-pound bombs, that's 250 kilograms, there we go, I got it in the end, and make the strike that way. However, at this point, you're essentially transforming your torpedo bomber into a horizontal bomber. It can't really dive bomb like the Dauntlesses, for example. And the accuracy involved in this hitting ships from a horizontal platform, especially when they're moving, well, let's just say in World War II, the accuracy at that point wasn't very high. There were some specialized squadrons, for example, the Japanese had them, that trained highly in the art of hitting a ship from a horizontal strike, but overall the accuracy wasn't very high. Also, the bombs would generally not inflict as much damage as, for example, a torpedo. So the trade-off was, either we take the torpedoes, and if we do score a hit, it's going to be probably able to sink the ship, but we are running the risk that our planes might not even be able to make it to the landing zone, or we give them bombs and they will certainly be able to make it, but once they're there, they might not hit anything. The compromise that was reached was that Yorktown would arm its Devastators with bombs, whereas Lexington would go ahead with the torpedoes. And Brett's Torpedo 2, as they approached the mountain range, they realized they were in for a doozy, because as closer as they got, they saw the earth coming towards them, the horizon got higher and higher and higher, and it really looked like they wouldn't be able to make it. And Brett, the commanding officer, essentially had two choices. Either he heads back, which essentially robs a very valuable weapon from the Americans that could bring some damage to the Japanese, or he runs the risk of not being able to make it over the mountain pass, and that some of his pilots, or if not all of them, would essentially be hanging in the trees. However, as he got close and as he realized that the moment to make a decision is approaching rapidly, suddenly he felt a stroke of genius. And as Jimmy Fatch, who was in the area at the time, remembers,
well, Brett saw a green, flat area in the sunshine and remembered his glider training. He got his ships over this area and then found an updraft of about 1,200 feet a minute. And then this just washed him up over the top and got him started down the other side. As he went over, Jimmy radioed to me, halfway house.
Hooray for basic training and glider practice. And in case you were wondering, nope, the Wildcats and the Dauntlesses did not have this issue. They made that jump without any hitch. Now, at this point, as everybody was passing the mountain pass, Commander Old veered off. I hope you do remember him. I did tell you he was important. And he essentially went on a personal mission. What is this mission, you might ask? Well, it essentially involved him just flying in circles. He was everybody's ticket to get home, and he would continuously transmit weather conditions, visibility conditions, and the like in order to inform the pilots that went on the strike and that came back of the conditions around this mountain pass. Essentially, the plan called for him to stay in the area until the last element had passed him on the way home, and then he too would be freed up to go towards the carrier once again. And it actually does emphasize, a certain amount of practicality, flexibility, but also care that was put into this strike, because there is nothing more, let's say, tragic than losing pilots, especially if their loss could have been avoided. Now, if a pilot gets hit by AA or a Japanese fighter, that's one thing, but if you lose a bunch of them because of deteriorating weather conditions in the mountains, then that is a loss you could have avoided by, for example, using somebody like Commander Old, which the Americans did at this point. At 9:20 a.m. the Americans started to trickle in, with Jimmy Thatch, of course, of Fighting Free leading the charge. Now, he found the ships in the bay, but for the rest the area seemed strangely deserted. There were no Japanese fighters going up to greet them, and neither was AA responding to the intrusion. And this left him and his boys somewhat bored and without a job. After all, they'd been sent ahead to clear path, and now they found no obstruction. So they started scouting out the area, and in the south next to Lae-Salamaua, they actually discovered that the Japanese had built a preliminary airstrip, but it was strangely deserted. Now, Jimmy Thatch didn't know this at the time, but the Japanese hadn't finished the construction of that airstrip until the day before the attack, and they were still waiting for their air complement to come in, which was due to come by in a couple of days' time. So they were completely lacking air cover in that regard. How is it for the ships and the naval presence that the Japanese had in the area? Well, due to a combination of factors, there were actually 16 ships in the bay at that point in time, and they, being caught completely unawares, were pretty much sitting ducks. Off Lae lay the transports Kongo Maru, Tenyo Maru, and Kokai Maru, covered by the destroyer Mutsuki and Yayoi. Slightly to the south, the miner Tsugaru and the two transports Tama Maru, number 2, and Hakoromo Maru, with Unagi as cover. Next to Lae-Salamaua lay the light cruiser Yubari, the flagship of the Japanese fleet. The transports Yokohama Maru and China Maru were anchored here, with the destroyer Oite and Asanagi to their east. Shuffling northeast, we find the destroyer Mochitsuki and the seaplane tender Kiwokawa Maru. This one will be important in due course. Shortly after Thatch, the first Dauntlesses start to arrive in the area, and it's this point that the Japanese are scrambling to unlimber 4 8cm heavy AA guns at Lae. The Dauntlesses, of course, see the motherload of transports at anchorage off Lae, and they go in with a vengeance. They drop their 500-pound bombs, and they claim 2 sunk and 1, the Kokai Maru, on fire. Additionally, 2 SBD Dauntlesses start attacking the light cruiser Yubari, claiming 1 hit. And once all their bombs are expended, they start working over the smaller ships in the area, the minesweepers and the mine layers, with 50 cal fire. It's at this point that disaster strikes for one of these pilots and one of these Dauntlesses. You see, the heavy AA guns that the Japanese have in the area, they're not really suited to track and shoot down fast-moving targets at low altitudes. They're really just meant to deter, for example, medium or heavy bombers flying in at altitude. However, one of them gets what is essentially a 1 in a million shot and scores a bullseye right into a Dauntless flying at 200 feet. The pilot and the gunner stand no chance, and the aircraft goes down into the sea. However, the Wildcats of Thatch have spotted this, and now finally they have a job, and they swoop in, drop their dinghy bombs, dispense a liberal amount of 50 cal fire, and successfully suppress the AA before it can do more damage. And this seems to have put them in a really good mood, because after their attack on this AA battery, they start working over the ships in the bay, aiming specifically for the bridges and the deck guns in order to confuse and also to weaken the Japanese defense. It is at this point that Hamilton's Bombing 2 and Brett's Torpedo 2 arrive. Hamilton's formation is of course flying SBD Dauntlesses armed with a 1,000-pound bomb, whereas Brett's Torpedo 2, as you will remember, was the formation that had to make that jump over the Owen Stanley Range using his glider training. They are armed with a torpedo. They are meant together to coordinate strikes and attack the same targets, and this was meant essentially to guarantee the most amount of hits on one target while also splitting AA fire. However, seeing this target-rich environment laid before them, the formations start to splinter and fracture, and different divisions and elements start going for different targets. For example, two of the Dauntlesses attack the mine layer Tsugaru, somewhat optimistically identifying it as a Mogami-class heavy cruiser. In any case, two close misses yield what they say light damage. Three of the Devastators, on the other hand, attack the transport ship Yokohama Maru. One of them scores a hit and she sinks in the shallows, whereas all the other Devastators shuffle up north to attack the transporters there. And this actually makes me think that either it wasn't obvious that these ships were sinking, or in fact they weren't as damaged as the American Dauntless pilots that attacked them previously thought they were. Otherwise this attack wouldn't have been executed. Anyway, these ships are sitting at anchorage. They're not moving, they're still, and they're the perfect target. The Dauntlesses, the Devastators, start swooping in, dropping their fish in the water, and at this point the bombardiers and the crews realize, well, our torpedoes, once they hit the water, either drown, malfunction, or veer off course completely. In fact, no hit is scored by these Devastators, and this is of course once again the sad and sorry tale of the Mark 13 torpedo in the early war period. On the other hand, while the Devastators aren't that successful, well, they sink one transport ship, so that's something. Thatch is still on standby. He's flying around this zone just looking for something to do for him and the pilots that he's commanding, fighting free. And sometimes they swoop down, they suppress an AA gun, they go back up again, and then they go down, maybe attack a ship, suppress that AA. But really there's nothing to do. And he actually notes that the Japanese have rather weak anti-aircraft defenses. He's not impressed by them at all, saying that the heavy AA guns that were, well, targeting them then once they were just circling at high altitude, seeing what was up, were routinely missing and not really making their shots count. In any case, this is Lexington's attack taken care of. Let's shuffle over to Yorktown and see how those boys did. As Yorktown Strike Force was approaching, there was one notable example of Japanese resistance that day. As mentioned earlier, Japanese AA was firing somewhat wildly and inaccurately all around them, but what really was hampering the Japanese that day was a lack of air cover. Now this changed somewhat with the Kiwokawa Maru, which is of course the seaplane tender stationed due east of Lae. It managed to launch a Nakajima E-8N2 Type 95 recon floatplane, or as the Allies called them, Dave. This was not a fighter, this was not an interceptor. It was armed with only one forward-facing 7.7mm machine gun and one gun of the same caliber facing rearwards, operated by the defensive gunner. Did the pilot and gunner care about their lack of armament? No, they did not. After launching a couple of attacks on the attacking Devastators, which failed to make an impression, they became embroiled in a wild dogfight with 4 different Dauntlesses. Successfully evading all the attack by the American Devastators, they actually managed to tag and strike a couple of the Dauntlesses in the process, although they did not inflict any lasting damage. Swift death was met by the Japanese at the business end of an intervening Wildcat. However, when the Americans returned to Lexington, they actually noted the determination and valor of the intervening Japanese pilot and his gunner. Sadly, although I tried, I was unable to ascertain the name of either the pilot and the gunner of that engagement. When Yorktown's fighters arrived, they realized, just like with Thatcher's flight, that they're pretty much out of a job. There is no Japanese air cover after all. So they follow Fighting Free's example by going after some of the boats and strafing them in gun runs. They also start targeting some of the smaller boats in the bay, fishing people out of the water. SPD Dauntlesses start attacking the Yubari and transport, whereas Yorktown's Devastators go for Kiwokawa Maru, the seaplane tender in the area. Now, usually at the altitude that they were flying at and executing this attack, 14,000 feet, just under 4,000 meters, you wouldn't really expect them to land a hit against a maneuvering seaplane tender. But they do. They score one hit, and even though the ship doesn't sink, it does require extensive repairs. The seaplane tender gets revenge somewhat by launching, just before this attack, a second Dave, which promptly attacks the Devastators. Now, it does manage to score a couple of hits, but it itself is not able to take down these torpedo bombers, or rather bombers in this instance. However, one of the gunners from the Devastators actually claims the kill on this Dave. He shoots at the incoming aircraft and notices that after a short gun run, it starts diving away violently. And he says, well, I must have knocked something out because otherwise this guy wouldn't leave. He's not wrong, but he's not exactly right either. Now, while he claims a kill, he hasn't in fact knocked out the Nakajima aircraft. However, he has punctured its main float. So that means when it landed, it actually started sinking and it sunk completely after the pilot and the gunner managed to get out. So while he claimed that kill, he actually did also receive it in the end, even though I don't know whether they actually realized that at the time. However, all in all, Yorktown's attack seems to be somewhat less impressive than that of Lexington, but there are a couple of reasons for this. By now, the Japanese had obviously realized that something was up. They had a couple of ships blown out of the sea in front of them, and that usually results in some kind of violent response. So they weren't really caught flat-footed at this point anymore, and were fully aware that, well, something was afoot. So the element of surprise that Lexington enjoyed was no longer valid for Yorktown. As well as that, all the easy targets were already taken care of by Lexington's flight, and pretty much Yorktown came in and, well, had to make do with the remaining ships that were already on the way, at alert and responsive in their actions. However, the attack itself was not finished. Yes, Lexington had executed its attack and they were already on their way back. And same thing for Yorktown, they were pretty much done for the day. However, just as they left, the Americans taught the Japanese something in inter-service cooperation, as the army did not want to be undone. And they had sent 8 B-17s to accompany the strike and hit the landing zones. They inflicted some damage on the Japanese. Also, when the Americans started to leave, they noticed the presence of some very strange looking aircraft, which they didn't really recognize. These were actually 8 Royal Australian Air Force Hudsons that also managed to attack the landing zone coming all the way from Port Moresby. Why the Americans weren't able to recognize the Hudson, even though it's an American aircraft, remains somewhat of a mystery, but there you go. Maybe the camouflage and the markings confused them somewhat. But all in all, the Americans were pretty jubilant in their attack, and once they went back towards Lexington and Yorktown, they didn't have any trouble on the way. They managed to get over the mountain pass with no issues. They celebrated in turn. There was good enough reason for the Americans to celebrate. After all, the Japanese had been caught completely off guard, and the Americans had inflicted on the Japanese some sort of mini Pearl Harbor. They claimed 9 ships sunk, 5 transports, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser and 1 destroyer, as well as heavy damage to 2 further destroyers, a gunboat and a seaplane tender, and all of this for the loss of a single SPD Dauntless dive bomber. That seemed pretty good. In actual fact, the damage inflicted on the Japanese was a little bit more limited. First of all, they did not have any heavy cruisers in the area. These were just ships misidentified. But the Japanese only, in apostrophes, lost 3 transports, as well as received damage to 1 of their transports and of course the seaplane tender. And then the Americans, as Lundstrom in his book The First Team puts it, put a couple of holes in Yubari, the mine layer Tsugura, and 2 further destroyers. Lundstrom's book, by the way, The First Team, is thorough by recommendation from my part. If you want to know more about this action and the Pacific War in general, get it. It's a really remarkable and exemplary book on that theater of operations. Thorough by recommendation from my part. Affiliate link in the description below. During these actions, the Japanese also lost a further 130 sailors dead and 245 Japanese were wounded. You might now be wondering, what did the Japanese do in response to this attack? Well, the first thing they did is of course send out a recon aircraft in order to ascertain the location and disposition of the American carrier fleet. And even though the Americans thought they evaded the recon flights, they didn't. The Japanese knew where the Americans were after about a day. However, bad weather set in, and this really covered the retreat and postponed any kind of retaliatory strike that could have been launched. And this meant, of course, that Lady Lex and Yorktown got away, and the Japanese had to wait another day to get their revenge. The Americans, while they were of course jubilant, did also realize that maybe they didn't inflict as much damage as they thought they did on the Japanese, and they were we're calling for caution. A lot of the internal memos say, well, we did launch a successful attack here, we did something good, but let's not overemphasize this attack just yet. However, what they didn't realize is actually that even though they had only sunk 3 transports, these transports were extremely valuable for the Japanese in the area. and the attack had somewhat shocked the Japanese. They really hadn't seen this coming, they really hadn't expected this, and they called in for more reinforcements. They called in a carrier fleet into the area in order to counter the American carriers. Also, some of the small land-based actions there delayed their attack on Moresby together with this strike. And really for the Japanese, this came as a complete surprise, and their whole schedule for the attack on Port Moresby and for the conquering of New Guinea was sent into disarray because of this one strike. I'm about to finish the video, but I thought about expanding a little bit on that last point. Now, even though the Japanese were seeing some really remarkable success in early 1942, they didn't really have everything going for them, especially considering the long haul. In the action of Bougainville on the 20th of February, they successfully drove off Lexington, but they lost quite a number of planes and they didn't really have replacements that could come in immediately. As well as that, they were currently engaged in Java in the Dutch East Indies, where roughly 100 transports was dispersed on the western and the eastern convoys that were sort of fueling and supplying that invasion. And this took huge drain on the Japanese, and really everything was concentrated on that area as much as possible. So Inoue, when he was launching this kind of invasion here in New Guinea, he was really, as the historian Willmott calls it, operating on a shoestring. And any kind of loss incurred would be worse than the actual number that defines them. And the Japanese, even though they were going from essentially victory to victory, were having setbacks and moments where they had to reflect a little bit on their long-term strategy, realizing that really they were operating with limited resources here and they couldn't just waste them and lose them. And in this sense, even though there's other engagements, for example, like the Battle of Balikpapan, the strike on Lae and Salamaua stand out. In fact, Roosevelt actually told to Churchill that this was the best day's work that they had so far. But the losses that the Japanese sustained there really made them rethink their whole approach of what was going on in New Guinea. And the losses, even though it's just free transport, you might say, because Inoue was on such limited resources, the value of that for the Allies was exponentially greater than the pure number. And this strike also is really a symbol, sort of, for the end of a comparatively unopposed Japanese onslaught in Southeast Asia and the South Pacific. Yes, Japan will continue to score victories even throughout the whole war, but the Battle of the Coral Sea is coming up, the Battle of Midway is coming up, and while these tactical and operational victories that the Japanese are pulling off are impressive, and while they will keep on happening, in a strategic sense, things are starting to change, and the strike on Lae and Salamaua perfectly encapsulates this. Add to that, of course, the complete kick that the American aviators and the Navy got out of the fact that they had essentially gotten revenge for Pearl Harbor in some sort of way. This is actually an attack that is quite significant. You got to remember that the Doolittle raid, which was the official response to Pearl Harbor, wasn't about to happen for a couple of weeks. So the Navy and the Americans were really looking for some good news, and here it was. They were able to inflict some significant damage on the Japanese and even put their war plans into disarray. However, they also considered there were some problems with the strike, mainly in the way that it was executed and with the equipment. First of all, they concluded that, you know, that pass over the mountain range in order to strike that landing craft with our overloaded planes, let's not do that again. Let's only do that in cases where there is no other way of handling the situation. We should really not do this again. Second of all, technical problems. Fogging of gun sights, specifically on the SBD Dauntlesses. When they were going from high altitude into the dive to the lower altitudes, the gun sights started to fog up and they really had to drop by the Mark I eyeball rather than having that gun sight to help them. Torpedoes, of course, I already mentioned those were an issue. And then also radios. There was a big problem in the area with planes actually being able to use radio communication in order to coordinate their strikes. As well as that, one of the most heavily criticized aspects was the short radius of the F4F Wildcat. An interim solution was proposed with drop tanks, but you've got to remember, this is really an issue, more so than you might think. The short radius of the Wildcats does not just endanger the Wildcats on this mission because they had to keep to a tight schedule. It also endangered the carrier fleet. It had to go as close as possible to the shoreline of New Guinea, and there it was. Well, it was a little bit vulnerable, really, for Japanese attacks. If the Japanese knew that they were there, they could have launched an attack quite easily. But with the introduction later on of drop tanks, this issue was somewhat mitigated. What really should be said, however, is that Thatch was pressing on one issue, and that is that fighters are fighters. The doctrine of using them with bombs really is not something that should be going ahead in the future. Fighter bombers with the Wildcat, with the limited bomb load that it has, it is absolutely ineffective and it should not be done. And Thatch said so really well when he said, really, fighters should be fighters. Thank you very much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure to share it with your friends and aviation enthusiasts around the world. If you want to check out our Patreon, you can earn some exclusive rewards there by supporting the channel and allowing us to make videos just like this one. I also want to thank SideStrafe for providing all voice lines that were not my own. And as always, have a great day, good hunting, and see you in the sky. To make matters worse, this area was also known for treacherous and sudden changes in weather conditions.